Creating distress ink backgrounds is one of my favorite things to do. Especially in the past few years, I created quite a few. The link to the playlist I will include in the description. And for my second video in my Christmas card series for this year, I wanted to show you what kind of backgrounds and shapes you can create. I have 5 backgrounds for you and 2 bonus ones. And normally I use 3, 4 or even 5 inks for each background. So to make it more interesting and challenging, I decided to use just 1 ink for each card. But feel free to use more. One more thing before I start, the colors and the way how you decide to finish the card, that's completely up to you. Alright, let's start with the first background. A straight blending from top to bottom or bottom to top, or a gradient, which is probably the most typical basic background, especially the one from top to bottom. For this background, I picked blue, the salty ocean, and because I'm using only one color, I'm doing a gradient. Very saturated at the top, fading to white at the bottom. If you have only one ink, you can add multiple layers of the color to make it darker. You can also fade into a lighter color or use different colors. I have here 3 blending brushes. In this video, I mostly use the basic one from Ranger with the foam attachment. This one gave me the best coverage. The other brushes are great, but it takes a while to get enough ink onto the brush. It doesn't happen all the time. This is one of those situations where one moment it works, the other it doesn't. I was using the Ranger blending brush at the top to build up the color, but towards the bottom I switched to the other brush. This one is a makeup brush from something like a dollar store, and I used it to smooth out the color and decrease the intensity of the color towards the bottom and fade it out. I also was trying to get rid of the circle streaks that you can get using the Ranger blending tool. You can get this dome blending foam. I heard it's better, but I don't have it. And I was able to smooth it out, and it also did not bother me much because I was going to do the typical thing when it comes to distress ink backgrounds. And that is, I added splatter. This is to get a look of a snowy sky. So I dipped my brush into a clean water and splattered the background, and then I used a paper towel to soak up the water. I repeated the process because there were some empty spots. Actually, later after I finished filming, I also splattered white gouache over it. I did not think about it when I was filming, it was sort of an afterthought. And in the end, you could hardly see the circle streaks from the blending. I think splatter helps if there are imperfections in your blending. Let me quickly show you how I finished up the card. I decided to only add a simple die cut greeting at the bottom of the card. Since I created a snowy background, I thought let it snow greeting will be perfect. I made 3 die cuts out of a white cardstock and glued them together. But before that, I first used the salty ocean and blended the ink over one of the die cuts. Here I was using a very tiny blending brush. This one is not a makeup brush, this one I bought in a craft store. I adhered all of the die cut greetings on top of each other. I spare you the pain watching me how I'm adhering those. Let's assemble the card. I first adhered the panel on top of a white card base using a liquid glue. The greeting I adhered right at the bottom of the panel, and to adhere it I used the liquid glue as well. Once the glue was dry, I cut the ends of the greeting on each side, and the card is done. Here you can see it in a close-up, very quick and simple. Moving on to the next type of a background, which is similar to the first, but you just changed the direction. A diagonal blending or gradient. Here I'm going to be using pink, the picked raspberry ink. And just like with the previous background, I started at the top, or more precisely at the top left corner. And I was switching between the blending tools as I was creating the background. Which direction you go is completely up to you. Even with the previous background, you could have the darkest shade at the bottom instead of starting at the top. Here you can start with any of the four corners. By the way, the cardstock I'm using here is the Canson XL. This is my preferred cardstock when I'm doing ink blending. But for the first background, I used a cardstock from a UK company, Paper Mill Direct. I bought it a few years ago and still have a few left over. I think it's quite good for ink blending. Many people use Nina Solar White. You can use whatever cardstock you prefer. To finish up the card, after I was done with the blending, I actually let the background fully air dry. I needed it to be dry because I was going to heat emboss. Air drying is just something I prefer. You could use a heat tool to dry the background or start with a heat embossing and then blend the ink. So I'm using an old snowflake stamp set, that's the only one I have. And after I had them attached to the door of my stamping tool, I first treated the paper with an anti-static powder. Next, I inked up the snowflakes with the Versamark ink. I restamped twice. Then I sprinkled a silver metallic powder over the snowflakes and heat set it with my heat tool. For the greeting, I picked a Merry Christmas die. I used a silver metallic embossing powder for the snowflakes and I wanted the greeting to match. So I picked this glittery silver cardstock and I die cut one greeting out of this cardstock and two additional out of a white cardstock. Just like with my previous card, I glued the die cut greetings on top of each other and then I assembled the card. I first adhered the background panel and then I adhered the greeting. Here is the finished card. Fun and glittery. I really love the pink. I think it fits the overall look. Let's move on to the third background type. A double-sided blending with a gap in the middle, or transition color in the middle. As I said, you can use additional colors instead of the white. For this background, I picked a purple ink, the Seedless Preserves, and I blended the ink diagonally again, but instead of going just from top to bottom, I also went from bottom to top, leaving a light gap in the middle. Since I was using only one ink, I applied multiple coats to increase the saturation of the color. This is what I did for all of the backgrounds. If you have just one ink color, to make it darker, you apply multiple coats. Once I was happy with the look, I let it completely dry. To make it into a card, I used an embossing folder with snowflakes and I ran it through my die cutting machine. If you watched my video with the Autumnal Distress ink background where I embossed leaves, I used there the Perfect Pearls powder. I really loved the look and had to do it again. I first used the Versamark ink and I dabbed the ink over the raised areas. Then I used a brush and I applied the powder over the snowflakes. And as a last step, I sprayed the panel with a clean water just to set the powder, but this I did off camera. To assemble the card, I adhered the panel on top of a white card base using a liquid glue, and the greeting I stamped and heat embossed with a bronze embossing powder, and I adhered it in the middle of the panel using a foam tape. Here is the finished card in a close-up. I really love how shiny it is. I definitely need more embossing folders and other colors with the perfect pearls. Or the Luna Paste by Simon Hurley. I think that looks cool as well. So these are my examples of the backgrounds where you blend inks from left to right, top to bottom, and so on. Before I move to the next type of backgrounds, let me show you my first bonus card. I have two for you, and this is the first one. I used here the Faded Jeans Distress ink to create a night sky. I thought I will do here the opposite of the first card, a gradient from bottom to top, but I was going to use this die cut of a Christmas village and there is snow at the bottom, so I needed to leave the bottom part white. And I also wanted the top to be white. So I blended the darkest shade across the middle of the panel, closer to the bottom of the cardstock, and I was fading it out towards the top and the bottom. It was quite difficult to apply the ink. Maybe I need a reinker. How do you even know you need a reinker? I often feel it's a combination of the paper, the tool, and the ink not being super juicy, but doesn't need re-inking yet. Anyways, I finished up the blending of the background and then I thought I want to have snowflakes across the blue background. But not the way how I did it on the first card. I have a stencil with snowflakes, and anytime I have a chance to use a stencil and especially embossing paste, I will do that. That's what I did here. I applied a white embossing paste across the blue background using a stencil with a snow background. After the paste was dry, I stamped a Merry Christmas sentiment at the top of the panel and I heat embossed it with a metallic embossing powder. To adhere the Christmas village, I did the opposite of what I did on the other cards. The white die cut was on the top and I die cut two additional pieces out of a dark blue cardstock. I adhered all of the die cuts on top of each other and then I glued the piece on top of the card. And lastly, I used a glitter pen and I applied it over the die cut image. This is just to add a little bit of sparkle to the card. And that's my bonus card. This is actually an inspiration from an older card that I made. This one, it is on this YouTube channel, but on my old blog, and I wanted to recreate it for my new blog. So here is the new card in a close-up. I really like the background, I love the snow, and I also like the die cut village. I really enjoy reusing this die cut anytime I can. Alright, let's move on to another type of backgrounds you can make, and that is to create a background for a focal point. Focal points or something else, that is completely up to you. The first one is to create a circle or an oval shape, going from inside out. I'm only using one color, so my outside color will be white. If I were using multiple colors, I would add lighter colors to the outside. So the inside is darker, outside is lighter. And for this background, I thought it would be fun to use yellow, not a typical color for Christmas cards. The exact ink I'm using here is the fossilized amber. And depending on your focal point, you want to either create a circle or an oval shape. I'm creating a circle because I'm using a snowflake as my focal point. Here I didn't use the Ranger blending tool at all because often it creates streaks and I wanted to have smooth edges. So I used the other blending tools instead. If I would be adding additional colors, then I probably would use it. It would be easier to blend the inks together. I still did not have a smooth background. There were some dark spots, but because I will be covering it, it did not matter. To make this into a card, I stamped a Merry Christmas greeting first. This time I used a black ink. After that, I used a stitched rectangular die and die cut the panel. Next, I took out my snowflake dies. These are the only ones I have, and I used the biggest one and I die cut two snowflakes. And I thought it would be fun to add some sparkle to the snowflakes. I could have used the glitter cardstock or the glitter pen, but I thought why not to use the perfect pearls again. But this time I'm using the perfect pearl color. And I first squished the snowflake into the Versamark pad. My Versamark pad definitely needs some cleaning. Then I applied the perfect pearls. As I said, this is the perfect pearl color, so it's just translucent with a little bit of shimmer. And lastly, I sprayed it with water, and I repeated this on the other snowflake as well. To assemble the card, I first adhered the panel on top of a card base. This time I used one that I made out of a craft cardstock. The snowflakes I adhered over the yellow background. I used a liquid glue and I only applied it over the inner part of the snowflake. And the second snowflake I adhered on top of the first snowflake, but I changed the direction. Lastly, I adhered one of these sparkly embellishments. I bought them years ago because they look pretty cool, but I never used them. Well, until now. The last thing I did here, I carefully lifted each, what is it even called, ends of the snowflake, just to give it more dimension. Alright, the card is done. I think it looks pretty cool. I love the yellow. It's really unusual for a Christmas card, but I think it still fits. And this particular card would work with all kinds of colors. So, moving on to the next background, which is pretty much the opposite of the previous background, and that is creating a frame. Going from dark to light, creating a circle or oval shape around your focal point. I'm using here a green, the Mowed Lawn ink. I apply the darkest shade along the edges of the panel, fading the color towards the middle. And here I was creating an oval shape because I will be using a die cut with a head of a deer, for which oval shape was much better. To make this into a card, I first adhere the panel on top of a white card base, again using a liquid glue. Most of the time I use liquid glue to adhere the panels because I don't want to make the cards too bulky and also too heavy because of the postage. Next, I die cut two of these deer heads, one out of a black cardstock and the other one out of a gold glitter cardstock. The gold one I adhered on top of the black one, and I attached it so it's a little bit offset. This way you can see the black behind the gold. I adhered the piece in the middle of the card, and here I used a foam tape so it's a little bit raised. Lastly, I thought for this card I use a greeting from the country where I live, which is Sweden, and they say here God Jul, meaning Merry Christmas. I don't have any stamps or dies, so I printed out a few greetings and I cut them out using my scissors. And I picked this one and I adhered it below the deer. Here is the card in a close-up. I love the green background and I really like the gold deer and how sparkly it is. So I wanted to show you one more card and what you can do if you have only one ink. For all the backgrounds I used a white cardstock, but you can use a colored cardstock and get a look with multiple shades. For this it's better to use a lighter cardstock and darker ink, but even though I did not do that, I was still able to make the ink visible. I did the same as on the previous background. I created a frame and I applied the ink along the edges. As I said, you can use these backgrounds for other things than just focal points. To make this into a card, for this background, I used a snowflake stencil and embossing paste. I placed the stencil over the background and I applied the embossing paste, and after I was happy with the application, I let it fully dry. After the banner was dry, I adhered it on top of a card base and I used a banner with Merry Christmas greeting. This banner I stamped with a brown ink on top of a craft cardstock. And that's it. That's all the backgrounds I have for you. There are a few more that I can think of, but the video is already too long and the ideas are just different versions of what I already made. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more inspiration, make sure you check out my Christmas card videos from previous years. The links to the playlist will be in the description below, where you will also find a playlist for my distress ink background ideas. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video.